Jeff, thanks so much. I was hustling with myself in regard to the first question, but finally came up with this. Um, was the article you wrote about Pat Foley the very first time you had ever heard the name Jack Quinlan?
No, no, I'd heard of him. I like to think I'm informed of Cubs history, not just the team, but the broadcasters. So, having talked with family members and other fans over the years, my uncle, my father, my grandfather, longtime Cubs fans, Jim West, I'm familiar with, Jack Quinlan, Jack Brickhouse, Vince Lloyd, Lou Boudreau, all these guys. Um, I've taken interest in, especially that I've gotten old since I've grown up. I've really become interested in the history of the franchise from even before they were at Wrigley. I have books here that I've been reading about them playing at the West Side grounds, dating back to the late 1800s. There's a book I had here before they were Cubs, when they were, all different kinds of names: the Orphans, the Colts, the Zephyrs. They were all they were had so many different names before they came up with Cubs. I think I have all those accurate. But yeah, I was familiar with Jack, not to the extent that I was when I wrote the story, which just blew my mind with what he brought to the table as a broadcaster and as a person.
Did you decided to interview Foley because he was retiring?
Yes, yes. He's my favorite of all time. Everybody has their favorite announcer, and mine is, I'd say, Pat Foley 1, Harry Carey 2. I'm 48, so I grew up with Harry and Steve. For the Cubs, for the Sox, it was Hawk Harrelson and Don Drysdale on both crews on television. But Pat, I said to Pat, "You put me to sleep." I, you know, Not pejoratively, but you were the last voice I would hear before I would fall asleep at night, because the games were at 7:30 and I'd be going to bed like 10:30, and I would fall asleep to Pat Foley, and he was just I just loved the way he called the game. So when he was announcing his retirement, it was special for me to be able to talk to him before he signed off. And I had heard his story about Jack Quinlan. I don't think so. We met for lunch one day, and that wasn't the first time I had heard the story, but I had heard him mention it before, and that's when it triggered that Jack was somebody who was really special, and I needed to hear more from Pat about that. And just that story itself is, I can't imagine. I'm sure it could happen today, but just the fact that somebody of that fame at the time, Jack Quinlan, saying to someone's father, "Hey, he can stay here. You go back to the seats." I just that's unfathomable to me, that you would have the trust of someone to leave your child with someone in the booth, and you go back on your way. And the fact that he was so gentlemanly about it, and fatherly, in that he showed Pat the ropes as a 10-year-old kid. It's mind-boggling to me. To have been that 10-year-old kid must have been mind-boggling for Pat also.
Do you have any idea in your mind's eye, after familiarizing yourself, hopefully more, with Jack Quinlan, what an obsession he was to us kids back in the day? And by that, I mean, a lot of us kids um, went to the ballpark not just to see Banks or Santo or Williams. We went to look up in that broadcast booth, hoping to
Yeah.
get a glimpse of Jack Quinlan. Jack Quinlan was a Pied Piper to us. We dreamed of being in that booth with him. He had such an amazing way about him. It was like he was crooking his finger and saying, "Join me on the radio."
I can. Um, Not so much as the Pied Piper, but boy, that must have been just wonderful. Because I would go to games and look for Harry, um, just because he was that for me at Wrigley. But Harry wasn't so much a Pied Piper to children as a Pied Piper to older people who could indulge in the drinks that Harry was drinking. But I still would always go to games and look in the broadcast booth often because that's what I was most interested in. I had my favorite ball players. Bill Buckner was my favorite growing up, but he was really the last one because I was more interested in. I love baseball. It's my favorite sport, but I was so enamored with the broadcasts of baseball games that I would record on the VHS at home every game that I went to. So I can go, so when I would come home after the game, I could listen to how Harry and Steve or whoever would call the big plays. I wanted to hear how it sounded. I wanted to hear the roar of the crowd off the television. I wanted to hear what they said about the plays. So yes, I can relate to the importance of the broadcaster in a fan's life because I felt that. I thought that was the most important part of the game was how it was presented to the fans on television. And I was most interested in that. So I can totally appreciate having that eye toward the press box because yeah, I was looking there too.
Did in your research, if that's a fair word, but in your study of Jack Quinlan after the Pat Foley article, after
Yeah.
perhaps your interest had been ignited in finding more about this guy Quinlan, did you do so?
Well, I listened to your clips on your website on the Facebook page, and it's spooky in a respect because obviously he's no longer with us. But I tried to bring his call into modern times, and there's no way he wouldn't be able to call baseball the way he called it then. Now he'd fit right in the way he called the action, the way he described it, the words he chose, the excitement that he brought to the broadcast. He could do it today. That's what really, it's a different time. People spoke differently. People used different vernacular, word choice, all of that. You could, obviously it was a long time ago, but the style, the grace, the enthusiasm, those elements that he had then would fit right in today. And I think that's what really struck me was that, my gosh, yeah, he was really good. And when you listen to broadcasters, sometimes it takes some time to warm up to them. But there are those who, when you hear it, you know it. It doesn't take long. And having not heard him for the time that you had the good fortune of hearing him and the few times that I've been able to listen to the clips, you know it. He was that good at his job where you could determine right away that he would fit in any era calling a game.
Uh, Bob Costas, who was an old broadcast mate of mine here in St. Louis and has been a friend for over 40 years, didn't even know what team Quinlan had done play-by-play for when I talked to him 20 years ago. And I said, Bob, I'm doing an audio book in tribute to Jack Quinlan, and I'm wondering if you'd listen to it and give me your thoughts. And he paused and said, oh, yeah, White Sox? And I said, no, Bobby, he was Cubs. Anyway, long story short, I sent him the audio book, Jeff, and it was several weeks later before I heard from him. Pick up the phone one day and he says, Barber, it's Costas. First thing out of his mouth was, I got to tell you, this guy Quinlan was one of the 10 best who ever got behind a mic. And
wow.
Yeah, and he said right now he's better than at least half of those who are in the Hall of Fame. And so, to me, Jeff, this long odyssey just never seems to end. Why isn't Jack Quinlan in the Hall of Fame?
I wish I had an answer for you. I think, he doesn't have longevity in um, on his resume, obviously, for circumstances beyond all of our control. Um, I'm sure the lack of available audio, obviously, we have samples from you for sure. But whether that's enough to convince people, I don't know. The Cubs didn't exactly um, win a lot to draw attention to them at the time. And I think I don't want to say there's recency bias, but there very well could be if you look at the people who are um, nominated every year for the Ford C. Frick Award. That could have something to do with it also. But it's like, that's why, when the NFL does their Hall of Fame nominations, at least from what I recall having covered those proceedings, you would have people present you um, to the Hall of Fame voters. One person was designated as, I'm going to advocate for this candidate. And clearly that's what Jack needs is advocates. And I think that's what's great about your page and your work is that we have the opportunity to do just that. So will it ever happen? I don't know. But as long as there's efforts to keep his legacy alive, and I think given that he did call the Cubs, that will always be there for us because they have such a following, because he had such a following that there are people out there who will continue to push that narrative that he belongs in there. You mentioned Bob. So when I did the story, I reached out to his people to see if I could talk to Bob, and obviously he's very busy, but he did make the time to email me comments, personalized comments from him, which was really all I needed. The fact that he took the time to type them up, and not just one. He sent me 4 or 5 specific with specific details that he wanted to get across. And he wrote back, let me know if there's anything else you need. Best, Bob. I think that just shows the power that Jack had, that to someone who he didn't know, didn't have hadn't heard, as you said, to have that impact on still is quite something.
I don't know whether you've read this or seen the comment I have in my audiobook. I talked to Vince Lloyd shortly before he passed away, and Vince was a great guy. I mean, he was just a wonderful fellow to talk to. He was spicy and just interesting. But I at one point I said to Vince, I said, Mr. Lloyd, do you have any doubt in your mind that Jack Quinlan deserves Cooperstown? And Jeff, he paused for a nanosecond and he said, oh, hell yes. And anybody who ever heard any 3 innings of any game he ever broadcast would agree. And that goes back to your remark, which is very true. In Jack Quinlan's time, the Cubs would lose 100+ games all the time. But anytime you turned on Jack and Lou on WGN, you knew you were going to get a real fun listen. That was Jack Quinlan. He was always enthusiastic, and he was so superb with his verbiage. He had a wonderful sense of humor. I remember one night, and back then, Jeff, all the kids stayed up late in their bedrooms pretending they were doing their homework, when in reality we were listening to the Cubs on a little transistor radio under our pillows. Thousands of kids did that. And I remember Jack in Los Angeles telling Lou, he said, well, Lou, I made it out here, but my baggage didn't. So tonight I'm wearing Hub shorts, Banks pants, and Santos shirt.
That's tremendous.
I mean, that was the sort of humor that he had, and it was constant. He was just a beautiful guy, and it's really been You know, and you know, of course, Jeff, that as you just said, the award for the best broadcaster in Cooperstown yearly is called the Ford C. Frick Award. Well, keep in mind that in 1960, then Commissioner Ford Frick chose
Mm-hmm.
a 32-year-old young man from a last
Yeah.
place team to announce arguably the most exciting World Series in history. Isn't it a little ironic that Jack Quinlan still isn't in the Hall of Fame?
Yes. That was an unbelievable note that you shared with me. But the story that I still can't get out of my head, well, and the vision of this is Jack, only day games then, but saying to the neighborhood kids, all right, I'm going to the ballpark. Who wants to come? That not only would that never happen today, uh, you know, that's not happening. Never mind that it was the Cubs announcer. A person isn't going out to the neighborhood kids and saying, I have Cubs tickets. Who wants to come and get in the car with me? Right. That's you're asking for trouble if you're even asking other kids that question. And the parents of those kids must never be thinking that that's never going to happen. That's just that's wild to me that, hop in the car, let's go to the park. He'd have the kids sitting in one spot. The ushers would be attentive to the kids, and what it was told to me was, he'd be looking from the radio booth down just to make sure everybody was okay. That's wild. I mean, that is wild to me, and I love that story, and it pops into my head sometimes when I'm going to a game or when I see kids at a game that I can see why he was a Pied Piper to that generation of kids, because he really was. Follow me to the ballpark. That's just fantastic.
Did you get any information, or I know that you and I talked about Jack in the Chicago Cubs Hall of Fame.
Yes.
Can you give our viewers any enlightenment on the possibility of getting Jack into the Cubs Hall of Fame?
Well, it's certainly possible, but it'll take work as well. They don't have an outlet for fans to suggest. There's no suggestion box at the front door where you drop a note into the box and say, I think this guy should be in your Hall of Fame. But they have a wonderful historian, Ed Hardig, who I plan to reach out to as a voucher for Jack Quinlan. And of course, he's obviously familiar with Jack. He's familiar with just about every aspect of Cubs history. But I will make that my role in advocating for Jack, in reaching out to Ed at some point and having a conversation with him to make sure that he is not forgotten in the discussions for future Cubs Hall of Fame classes. The people who make those decisions, they're members of the media, members of the Cubs, Ed Hardig himself. So I hope to be at least keep him at the forefront of their minds when they have discussions on who to nominate, because at some point, I think that's where he probably belongs most, given his role in Cubs history, given the fandom that he had. And in this city and with our teams, announcers are legendary, and they are so important. They are the connective tissue to the fans. Here, maybe more than in any other city. You can argue New York, of course, but they're celebrities here, whether you're on television or radio. And they're not just sports. News anchors, weather people are legendary in this city. Mm-hmm. And I think it speaks to the provincial feel that residents have, and just the history of this city itself and the history of media in this city. So I think there is certainly hope to get him in there at some point. And I plan to certainly make a pitch for him, as I would hope others would too.
Will you keep us updated in regard to what the many, many followers of this Facebook page can do themselves as far as emailing or calling or writing? Will you keep us in the loop in that regard?
Of course, of course. I don't think there's any. I didn't get they get the sense there was any emailing to be done. Like I said, they weren't accepting suggestions. They weren't taking suggestions, which I understand. This is a difficult thing. Um, it's still only in its third year. They've had two classes, I believe, and that first class obviously was enormous because they had some catching up to do, not having their own Hall of Fame for so long. And again, I understand that you got to have Harry Carey in there early. You got to have Jack Brickhouse in there early. There are people who have had historic impacts on this franchise, but Jack certainly is among that crowd, and I hope at some point he receives his due, and that his family, his daughters, can see that as well, because I think it'd be they were there. I spoke with they were a part of that, and it would be wonderful for them to have that knowledge of his significance in Cubs history certified as well.
You know that Jack was born Cubby Blue.
Yeah.
Harry Carey was born Cardinal Red, and I can
Yeah.
attest to that
Yes.
because I've been in St. Louis and Environs for many decades. Harry Carey was not a Chicago Cub. Harry Carey reinvented himself and did a darn good job. But keep in mind, he was in the White Sox broadcast booth before the Cubs. He was in the Oakland A's broadcast booth with Charlie Finley before the Cubs. So all I'm pointing out that among Jack Quinlan's many attributes is the fact he was a Cub from the time he was a little one practicing with a tape recorder in the right field bleachers in the 1930s.
Lived in Evanston, right? He had a home in Evanston. Where is that right? If I remember.
Yes, I think Susie still
I think I
lives.
had that in the story.
And Mrs. Quinlan, who was a marvelous person, resided there too. But I thought Jack grew up in Wilmette, maybe, not sure. But
okay. Oh yeah. I know he's local. He's as local as you can get.
And I have to also let you know, and you probably have read it, but Pat Hughes was one of our biggest boosters for years. And all of a sudden, in fact, at one time, Pat told me, he said, I hope that someday, if ever there's an opportunity for me, that I have somebody like you advocating for me the way you do for Jack Quinlan. So isn't it ironic that Pat Hughes goes in before Jack Quinlan? I guess I can't quite wrap my pea brain around that one.
Well, Pat's outstanding, and he's been doing it for over since the early '80s. So there's that longevity that sadly Jack lacks from having his life taken at such a young age. But Pat is certainly well deserving of that honor. For his years calling the Brewers with Bob Uecker, but he made the Cubs radio job took him to another level because it gave him an enormous audience, which I can't imagine he had with the Brewers. It gave him a worldwide audience with Cubs fans all over the place. And to have his voice as the only local call of them winning the World Series and the way he made that call, that's his signature moment. That's going to be on every highlight film of Cubs history for eternity. So he's certainly well deserved of that honor. And it was a heck of a year for him, right? He got into the Cubs Hall of Fame in September or in August, and then he was inducted in September. But then in December, he's in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So heck of a finish to 2022 for Pat Hughes for sure.
Well, I can also tell you this, that there are plenty of us aging baby boomers who envisioned and pictured the voice of Jack Quinlan calling that World Series as well.
Yeah.
And making we'll call.
You know, it could change the course of Cubs broadcasting history had he stayed alive into the '69 season. I mean, can you? That would have been unbelievable. And then you wonder how that might have affected Jack Brickhouse's future with the franchise. I mean, there's so many, sliding doors
Right.
moments that you could play through your head and just guess. But yes, it was a tragedy beyond belief.
And we'll skip to current day Cubs very quickly, but I got to make one final remark here that in 2015, this is before you and I made our acquaintanceship, Susie Quinlan and I put forth a Herculean effort to get Jack Quinlan into the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And I mean, I talked to virtually every member of the nominating committee, most of whom are now gone, Joe Garagiola and Jack Buck, many others. And the Hall of Fame was extremely secretive, but what I was able to wrest from them was, yep, you guys are getting a lot of support for Jack Quinlan. And I knew that we were, Jeff, because of the feedback I was getting. Bob Costas has voted for Jack Quinlan every single time. Every single time. And he's got some influence. And we had huge fan support that year. Well, push comes to shove. I think Dick Enberg got in instead of Quinlan. Dick Enberg, of course, was a very popular broadcaster, but not radio, mostly TV. But the fact is, when I contacted the Hall of Fame and I said, well, where did Jack Quinlan finish in the voting? They never would give me any real information. Found it very interesting, Jeff, that the very next year, all of a sudden, Cooperstown decides, whoops, we're not going to let the fans vote anymore. So from that year on, no more fan balloting. Kind of an interesting little take on things.
Yeah. Yeah. With something as personal as broadcasting, because it is the voice, it's what connects the team to the fan is the broadcast. You would think that the fan would have at least an opportunity to have a say. They don't have to be the prevailing opinion, but at least have the opportunity to express how they feel and for the people who make the decisions to be aware of that. And I think that's where, you come in, Ron, is making sure that voice of the fan is still available for the people who make those decisions to hear. Whether they want to or not, they'll come across it at some point, most likely. And so your efforts are certainly applauded. I applaud your efforts to keep this fight going for Jack, because it's a worthwhile one. In our world of baseball and broadcasting, it is a very worthwhile one to make sure that those who should be remembered are remembered. Because in 100 years from now, who's gonna stand up for him? So that's what we have to do, in this situation.
Well, it's like I point out as often as I can, Jack Quinlan was a part of our boyhood, and in many cases, our girlhood. As much a part as hula hoops or howdy doody on Saturday morning. Jack Quinlan was able to insinuate himself into our young lives. And I'll tell you this, Jeff, the morning Jack Quinlan was killed, a lot of our lives, a lot of our young lives came to a halt. They came to a halt. And every baby boomer who grew up loving Jack Quinlan and listening to Jack Quinlan, his or her life changed that day and was never the same. And every one of us can tell you exactly where we were and what we were doing that morning.
I can't imagine. I remember when Harry Carey died. I can tell you where I was. I vividly remember being at the television watching the news break that he had died, but obviously he was a much older man and in ill health. So I can understand the impact of such an occurrence. I can't possibly relate to that at all. But what I can relate to though is the impact of the broadcaster. That's how I have felt about Pat Foley. So he's done. He's off in retirement world, which is wonderful for him. I know he's enjoying it, but you can't tell me that he couldn't still broadcast for another 5 years minimum. And so in columns that I'd written about the Hawks changing of the guard there, and this is no knock on Chris Foster, so I think it's going to be great. I am a Chris Foster's fan. At the same time, though, a part of my childhood was going to be lost if I didn't hear Pat Foley's voice calling Hawks games. And I knew that, and I wanted that out there. I wanted people to understand that the importance of having him on those games was, and that the fact he's not going to be there anymore, it's going to be a different world for Hawks fans. And I expressed that because I still haven't probably gotten there yet, because sometimes I'll hear his voice, on a radio show or on YouTube or whatnot, but it takes time to, I guess, grow up. You have to get past that. With the world changes, there's always change, and it stinks sometimes. And it stinks that I don't get to hear him on the call anymore. But it was such an important part of my childhood and an important voice in my ear that I miss it. So I can completely understand not having that voice, that comfort food for your head, to not have that anymore. It's disappointing. And in some respects, it's crushing. So I can completely relate to that loss of Jack Quinlan as a child, and not being able to have that anymore, because that's your connection to the Cubs, and that connection was gone, and it's just must have been so sad. I can't relate, but I can understand how that must have felt.
Quick comment. Please help us out going forward any way you can. That's all I'm asking from
of course.
All of us. And we've got, I think, a couple of quick minutes. How do you like the Chicago Cubs 2023?
I get to put on my baseball analyst hat, which is a challenge. I'm excited. How can you not be with the guys they brought in? Dansby Swanson. That's amazing. Cody Bellinger in center field. It's a 180 what we've had the last couple of years with just nameless ball players. And when I think about that, it's not just the Cubs, it's the Bears who have gone, scorched earth on their roster. The Blackhawks have gone scorched earth on their roster. The Cubs did. Can we find a team that isn't rebuilding in this city? It's absurd. The sky, the fire, name one that hasn't been through this in the last 5 years. You can't. So I'm done dealing with prospects and draft picks. I'm tired of it all. I want to see a professional product on the field. And by all accounts, we're gonna see that this year. Are they going to hit? Well, I hope so. I think they will. The Suzuki injury is obviously a blow, but they got names. They got Trey Mancini, Eric Hosmer. They're going to be great. I don't know, but they're professional ball players. They're names, and that has me excited. I think they're going to be very competitive in that division. I know Wilson Contreras is on the enemy now, but you can't tell me there's that big of a difference between the Cubs and the Cardinals. and the Brewers as well. I think it's going to be another hard fought division, and I'm just glad that it's going to be competitive again because I know it was only 2.5 years. I got tired of another
Oh,
rebuild.
oh,
I'm done with rebuilds. Why, why can't why can't some of these teams be like the Dodgers and the Cardinals? And I hate to say it, like to be like the Cardinals, where they're just you just reload. You're just
right.
always competitive. So I'm glad that we're going to have competitive games again.
All I can say in closing is stand in line and take a number because we're all in that queue. We're all in the queue with you, Jeff.
It is so, and look, I get what they had to do with Rizzo and Bryant. It was hard
I
to
don't.
accept, but I understood they hung on either too long or they didn't improve them as players to the point where we thought they would. But man, that was a gut punch. And then have to go through that all again what we went through in 2012 and 13 and 14.
You just
Like we just did this. Why are we doing this again? It's hard, but look, it's sports, it's baseball, it's entertainment. We'll live, we'll get through it, and now here we are.
and more than anything, it's become what, Jeff? A business.
A bit. I was just gonna say that. You beat me to it. Yes, a business. It's all a business. Now next is, can the Bears get there? I hope so. I don't know. Can the Hawks get there? Good Lord, it might be a decade until that thing is rectified. It feels like. Of course, you have the Blues in St. Louis. They're kind of doing the same thing, but different story, different podcast.
Hey, thank you so much. Will you come back and visit us again?
Anytime. I love talking to you, Ron. Always. It's a
Jeff,
pleasure. Thank you for having me.
thank you so much, Jeff. I love this, and I'm sure everybody will love hearing from you.
I will. I That's very kind of you to say. I really appreciate that, and I thank you for involving me in this endeavor. It means a lot. I appreciate the thoughts.
Talk to you soon, Jeff.
Thank you, Ron.
Bye bye.